I watched them all laughing around the conference table, champagne flutes clinking as they celebrated what they called our brilliant new brand direction. My brilliant new brand direction. The one I'd pitched 3 months ago that had been dismissed as too ambitious and not aligned with our core values. Yet here it was, being paraded around with someone else's name attached to it. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. They had no idea who they were dealing with. My name is Julia Mercer, and until 6 months ago, I was just another mid-level marketing executive at Helios Dynamics, a tech company that specialized in consumer analytics software. I wasn't the type to rock the boat. I came in, did my work, and went home. I was good at my job, respected by my peers, but largely invisible to upper management. That all changed the day I had my epiphany about rebranding our flagship product. The idea had come to me during my morning run. A complete reconceptualization of how we positioned ourselves in the market. Not just a new logo or tagline, but a fundamental shift in how we communicated our value. I'd spent weeks refining it, creating mock-ups, developing a strategic rollout plan. I was certain it would transform our struggling product line. When I finally secured a meeting with the executive team, I was nervous but confident. I'd prepared meticulously, anticipating every possible question. The presentation went well, or so I thought. They nodded, asked appropriate questions, thanked me for my initiative. Then Marcus Blackwood, the VP of Marketing and my direct supervisor, closed his leather portfolio and smiled that practiced smile of his. Julia, this is interesting work, but I'm not sure it's the direction we want to take right now. We need something more conservative, less disruptive. I left that meeting disappointed, but not defeated. This was corporate life, after all. Ideas got shot down all the time. I filed away my presentation and went back to my regular duties, focusing on the quarterly marketing campaigns we had in progress. 3 months later, I was sitting in the monthly all-hands meeting when Marcus took the stage, a triumphant grin on his face. Today, I'm thrilled to announce a bold new direction for Helios, he began, and proceeded to unveil what was, point for point, concept for concept, my rebranding strategy. Except now it was being presented as the brainchild of Danielle Reynolds, the new marketing director who had been hired just 6 weeks prior. I felt my face burn as I watched the presentation unfold. My color scheme, my messaging framework, even the specific language I had crafted to describe our product's benefits. All of it stolen, without so much as a nod to my contribution. I looked around, wondering if anyone else remembered my presentation. But if they did, they gave no indication. Either they didn't recall, or they didn't care. After the meeting, I approached Marcus in the hallway. That presentation looked familiar, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He barely glanced up from his phone. Did it? Danielle's been working on this for weeks. She's really knocked it out of the park. It's my work, I said, more firmly this time. The exact strategy I presented to the executive team 3 months ago. Now he looked at me, his expression a mix of annoyance and dismissal. Julia, your concept was similar in some ways, but this is much more refined, more professional. Don't take it personally, we're all working toward the same goals here. I stood there, speechless, as he walked away. The injustice of it burned in my chest. I'd been in corporate environments long enough to know that this happened. Ideas got borrowed, credit was misattributed. Usually, the advice was to let it go, to pick your battles, but something in me refused to accept this. Not this time. That night, I pulled out my original presentation materials and compared them to what had been presented at the all hands. The similarities were undeniable, not just the general concept, but specific elements that could only have come from my work. I still had the original files with their metadata and creation dates. I had emails discussing my ideas with colleagues before I'd even requested the executive meeting. I also had something else, something neither Marcus nor Danielle knew about. In my research for the rebranding, I'd created a unique name for our new product suite, one that perfectly encapsulated the value proposition. I'd included it in my presentation as an option but hadn't emphasized it. They had overlooked it in their rush to steal everything else. and I hadn't registered it anywhere in the company's systems. The next morning, I called a lawyer who specialized in intellectual property. I laid out my situation, showed her my evidence, and asked about my options. "Well," she said, after reviewing everything, "since you created this as an employee, most of it legally belongs to the company. But this name, this Prisma Protocol concept, if it wasn't formally submitted as part of your work product, and if the company hasn't claimed ownership or begun using it—" "They haven't," I confirmed. "They're calling it Insight Engine." "But Prisma Protocol was my original concept," she smiled. "Then we might have something to work with." Over the next 2 weeks, I invested my own money to file a trademark application for Prisma Protocol and several related terms that were central to my branding concept but hadn't yet been used by Helios. I created a basic business entity, developed a rudimentary website describing services similar to but legally distinct from what Helios offered, and waited. Meanwhile, the Insight Engine rebranding moved forward at Helios. Marcus and Danielle received accolades from the CEO. There was talk of bonuses, promotions. I kept my head down, did my work, and said nothing more about the theft of my ideas. As far as they knew, I had accepted the situation and moved on. 6 weeks later, my trademark applications were approved. The next day, I submitted my 2 weeks' notice. Marcus accepted it with minimal interest, assuming I was leaving because of what had happened. "Sometimes it's best to make a fresh start," he said, with false sympathy. "I'm sure you'll find something more suited to your level." I smiled and thanked him for the opportunity to work at Helios. I cleared out my desk, said my goodbyes, and left without fanfare. As far as Helios Dynamics was concerned, Julia Mercer was no longer their problem. 3 days after my last day at Helios, their legal department received a certified letter from my attorney. It outlined my ownership of the Prisma Protocol trademark and several related terms, noted the similarities between their Insight Engine branding and my registered intellectual property, and requested an immediate meeting to discuss potential infringement issues. The panic this caused was immediate. I learned later that the executive floor erupted into chaos. The Insight Engine rollout was already in progress. Marketing materials had been printed. The website had been updated. Client presentations had been scheduled. And now this potential legal complication threatened to derail everything. When my phone rang that evening and I saw Helios's main number on the caller ID, I allowed myself a small smile before answering. "Julia, it's Richard Kent." The CEO himself, not Marcus. "Interesting. We've received some communication from an attorney claiming to represent you." "Yes," I said calmly. "That's correct. I have to say, this comes as quite a surprise. I thought you were a team player." "I am," I replied. "When I'm treated as part of the team." There was a pause. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do, Richard. But if you need clarification, my attorney would be happy to provide it during our meeting." Another pause. Longer this time. "Julia, I'm sure we can resolve this without formal meetings and legal posturing. Why don't you come in tomorrow, and we can discuss this reasonably?" "I'd be happy to meet," I said. "But my attorney will be accompanying me. This is a legal matter now, after all." He couldn't hide the irritation in his voice. "Fine. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. The next morning, I walked back into Helios Dynamics not as a former employee, but as a potential legal adversary. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw me, and I could tell the news had spread. My attorney, Sophia Williams, walked beside me, professional and composed in her tailored suit. We were escorted to the main conference room, where Richard Kent, Marcus, Danielle, and Helios's legal counsel awaited us. The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus wouldn't meet my eyes. Danielle looked confused and frightened. Richard attempted to control the meeting from the start, speaking about loyalty and professional ethics. My attorney smoothly interrupted him. "Mr. Kent, my client has documented evidence that her intellectual property has been misappropriated by Helios Dynamics. We're here to discuss remedies, not lectures on loyalty. She proceeded to lay out our case methodically, my original creation of the branding concepts, the subsequent presentation to the executive team, the clear similarities between my work and what was now being marketed as the Insight Engine, and finally, my legal ownership of the Prisma Protocol trademark and related terms. The way we see it, Sophia concluded, Helios has two options. Either completely redesign your rebranding to eliminate all elements that infringe on Ms. Mercer's intellectual property, which, given the extensive similarities, would essentially mean starting from scratch, or negotiate a licensing agreement for the use of her trademarks and concepts. Marcus finally spoke up, his face flushed with anger. This is absurd. Julia developed those concepts as an employee of Helios. They belong to the company. Actually, Sophia replied, sliding a document across the table. Ms. Mercer's employment contract specifies that the company owns work product that is formally submitted and accepted through official channels. Ms. Mercer's presentation was explicitly rejected by this gentleman right here. She nodded toward Marcus. We have the email. After that rejection, her continued development of the Prisma Protocol concept was done on her own time, outside of company resources. I watched as Helios's attorney reviewed the document, his expression growing increasingly concerned. He leaned over to whisper something to Richard, who frowned deeply. Furthermore, Sophia continued, even if there were any ambiguity about ownership of the general concepts, which there isn't, the trademarks for Prisma Protocol and related terms are unquestionably the legal property of Ms. Mercer's business entity. Your current rebranding materials contain multiple instances of language that infringe on these trademarks. The meeting lasted for 3 hours. Helios's legal team tried various arguments, from claiming that my work was indeed company property to suggesting that my trademark applications were filed in bad faith. Sophia countered each point with precision, always returning to the core facts. My work had been rejected, then stolen, and I now legally owned key elements of the intellectual property they were attempting to use. Eventually, Richard called for a break. As Helios's team huddled in a corner of the room, I maintained my composure, though inside I was trembling with a mixture of anxiety and vindication. This could still go either way. They could decide to fight, to take their chances in court. But I knew something they didn't. I was prepared for a long battle. In the weeks since discovering the theft of my work, I had documented everything meticulously. I had reached out to former colleagues who had witnessed the development of my ideas. I was ready. When they returned to the table, Richard's demeanor had changed. The bluster was gone, replaced by a tightly controlled pragmatism. We're prepared to discuss a licensing agreement, he said. The words clearly difficult for him. But we need to be realistic about terms. The negotiation that followed was intense. They tried to minimize the value of my intellectual property, to characterize it as just one small element of their overall rebranding strategy. Sophia and I held firm. We knew the truth. Without my concepts, their entire Insight Engine initiative would collapse. By late afternoon, we had the framework of an agreement. Helios would license the Prisma Protocol intellectual property from my business entity for a substantial upfront payment plus ongoing royalties. My name would be credited in all materials as the creator of the concept. And this was the point Marcus fought hardest against. There would be a formal acknowledgement to all Helios employees about the true origins of the rebranding strategy. As we prepared to leave, Richard pulled me aside. You could have come to me directly, he said quietly. Before all this legal maneuvering, I looked him straight in the eye. Would you have listened, or would you have taken Marcus's word that I was just being difficult? He had no answer for that. The official announcement came 2 days later. The company-wide email explained that there had been a misunderstanding regarding the development of our new branding initiative, and that Julia Mercer was the original creator of the concepts now being implemented. It went on to state that Helios had entered into a licensing agreement with my company for the use of certain intellectual property. The reactions were immediate and varied. Some colleagues sent me private messages of congratulation. Others seemed uncomfortable. Uncertain how to respond to this unusual situation, Marcus avoided all contact with me, though I heard through the grapevine that he had been called to several closed-door meetings with Richard and the board of directors. Danielle Reynolds, surprisingly, reached out to me directly. We met for coffee at a neutral location, away from the office. I had no idea, she said, looking genuinely distressed. Marcus gave me the files and said they were preliminary concepts that needed development. He never mentioned they came from you. I believed her. Danielle had been new, eager to make her mark, and Marcus had used her as a convenient front for the theft of my work. It's not your fault, I told her, but maybe in the future, ask more questions about where ideas originate. She nodded, looking both chastened and relieved. What happens now? With you, I mean. It was a good question. The licensing agreement had provided me with significant financial compensation, enough that I didn't immediately need another job. My new business entity, initially created just to hold the trademarks, now had real value and potential. I'm exploring my options, I said, and I was. Several competitors had already reached out, having heard through industry channels about what had happened. There was also the possibility of developing my own consulting practice, leveraging the sudden notoriety I had acquired. 1 week after the announcement, I received another call from Richard Kent. We'd like to discuss your returning to Helios, he said without preamble. I was momentarily speechless. Excuse me? The board has reviewed the situation. We recognize that mistakes were made in how your contributions were handled. Marcus Blackwood is no longer with the company. So they had fired him. I felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. Satisfaction, certainly, but also a strange sort of regret. I hadn't set out to destroy Marcus's career, just to claim what was rightfully mine. We're creating a new position, Richard continued. Executive Creative Director, reporting directly to me. We'd like you to consider taking it. The offer was tempting, I had to admit. A significant promotion, direct access to the C-suite, the chance to implement my ideas with full authority and recognition. It would be a vindication of everything I had fought for. But as I considered it, I realized something important. Helios dynamics hadn't changed. Yes, Marcus was gone, but the culture that had allowed him to steal my work and claim it as his own, that remained. Richard had only acted when forced to by legal pressure, not out of any sense of right and wrong. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I've decided to move in a different direction. There was a pause on the line. I see, Richard finally said. May I ask what you'll be doing? I'm starting my own consulting firm, I told him, the decision crystallizing even as I spoke the words. Specializing in authentic brand development and corporate culture alignment. Authentic brand development, he repeated, and I could hear the irony in his voice. Well, you certainly have a unique perspective on that now. Yes, I agreed. I do. After we hung up, I sat for a long time, thinking about the journey of the past few months. I had gone from being a competent but overlooked employee to someone who had stood up against corporate theft and won. The path hadn't been easy or comfortable. There had been moments of doubt, of fear, of wondering if I was overreacting or if the fight would be worth it. But now, as I began to outline the business plan for my new venture, I felt a sense of purpose and clarity I'd never experienced at Helios. This wasn't just about revenge, though the vindication had been undeniably sweet. It was about recognizing my own value and refusing to let others diminish or steal it. Within 6 months, my consulting firm, Authentic Paradigm, had secured contracts with 3 mid-sized companies looking to revitalize their brands. My experience at Helios had become a kind of calling card, a story that resonated with clients who valued integrity and originality. I hired 2 associates, then 3 more. We developed a reputation for innovative work that maintained the unique voice and vision of each client. 1 year to the day after my confrontation in the Helios conference room, I received an email from Danielle Reynolds. She had left Helios as well and was now working for a competitor. Thought you might find this interesting, her message read, with a link to an article in a business journal. The piece detailed Helios Dynamics' continuing struggles with the Insight Engine rebrand. Despite the licensing agreement that allowed them to use my concepts, the implementation had been fragmented and inconsistent. Client adoption was below projections. The stock price had dropped 15% over the past 2 quarters. The article quoted an anonymous insider. There's a difference between having access to a great idea and truly understanding it. Helios has the former, but lacks the latter. I closed the article, feeling neither joy nor sorrow at Helios's difficulties. They had the blueprint I had created, but not the vision to execute it properly. In a way, that was its own form of justice. Later that week, I stood before a room of potential clients, presenting Authentic Paradigm's approach to brand development. As I spoke about the importance of integrity, authenticity, and proper attribution in the creative process, I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in the glass wall of the conference room. I barely recognized the confident, authoritative woman I saw there. The journey from invisible employee to respected business owner had transformed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had discovered strengths I didn't know I possessed: resilience, strategic thinking, the courage to stand alone when necessary. The theft of my work, painful as it had been, had ultimately forced me to claim something more valuable than a single branding concept: my own power. As the presentation concluded and the room filled with approving nods and thoughtful questions, I realized that my revenge, if that's what it had been, had evolved into something far more meaningful. I hadn't just reclaimed what was stolen from me, I had discovered who I truly was. And that, I now understood, was the most valuable intellectual property of all. 3 years after the confrontation at Helios, Authentic Paradigm had grown into a respected boutique agency with offices in 3 cities. We specialized in helping companies align their external branding with their internal values, a niche I had identified through my own experience. Our client list included several Fortune 500 companies as well as promising startups looking to establish authentic brand identities from the ground up. The story of how I had stood up to Helios had taken on a life of its own, evolving from industry gossip into a case study taught in business ethics courses at several universities. I occasionally gave guest lectures, sharing the experience with students and emphasizing the importance of both protecting their intellectual property and maintaining their personal integrity. Marcus Blackwood had landed on his feet, as people like him often do. After a brief period of unemployment, he had secured a position at a smaller firm in a different city. I heard through mutual connections that he told a very different version of the Helios story, one that cast him as the victim of corporate politics and an ungrateful subordinate. I found I didn't care. His narrative couldn't change what had actually happened, and my success spoke for itself. Helios Dynamics had eventually abandoned the Insight Engine branding altogether, writing off the initiative as a failed experiment. They had paid out the full term of our licensing agreement but never managed to capture the essence of what made the concept powerful. Richard Kent had been replaced as CEO after 2 consecutive years of declining revenue. The company still existed but had lost significant market share to more innovative competitors. On a crisp autumn morning, I was reviewing applications for our firm's new creative director position when my assistant informed me that someone from Helios was in the reception area asking to speak with me. Curious, I agreed to the meeting. The woman who entered my office was unfamiliar to me, young, professionally dressed, with an eager intelligence in her eyes. "Ms. Mercer, thank you for seeing me," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Emma Daniels, Head of Innovation at Helios Dynamics." I shook her hand, intrigued. "What can I do for you, Ms. Daniels?" She took a seat across from me, her posture conveying both confidence and respect. "Helios is undergoing a complete restructuring," she explained. "New leadership, new direction, new values. We're trying to rebuild a culture of innovation and integrity." I nodded, waiting for her to continue. "Your story is well known within the company," she said. "It's become a kind of cautionary tale about what happens when an organization fails to value its talent and maintain ethical standards." This was surprising and somewhat gratifying to hear. "I appreciate you telling me this, but I'm not sure why you're here." Emma leaned forward slightly. We'd like to hire Authentic Paradigm as consultants for our cultural transformation. Who better to help us rebuild than someone who understands exactly where we went wrong? The irony was perfect, almost too perfect. The company that had stolen my ideas now wanted to pay me to teach them how to be authentic. For a moment, I was tempted to refuse on principle, to tell her that some bridges can't be rebuilt. But as I considered the proposition, I realized that this represented something I hadn't expected: the opportunity for true resolution, not just personal vindication, but the chance to transform the very culture that had necessitated my stand in the first place. It won't be easy, I told her. Real cultural change never is, and I won't sugarcoat my assessment of what needs to be fixed. Emma nodded. We don't want you to. We need honesty, not comfort. 2 weeks later, I walked back into the Helios Dynamics headquarters for the first time in more than 3 years. The physical space looked much the same, but the energy was different, more subdued, perhaps, but also more authentic. There was a humility that hadn't existed during my time there. The new CEO, Teresa Huang, met with me personally before the first workshop. Thank you for agreeing to work with us, she said. It can't be easy to come back here. It's not about easy, I replied. It's about right. And sometimes, the right thing means returning to difficult places with new purpose. As I stood before the assembled leadership team, many of whom had been with the company during the Insight Engine debacle, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. The anger and hurt that had driven my initial actions had long since transformed into something more constructive, a commitment to helping organizations do better. Many of you know my history with Helios, I began. Today, we're not here to rehash the past, but to learn from it. The question before us isn't who was right or wrong 3 years ago. The question is, what kind of company do you want to be tomorrow? Over the following months, Authentic Paradigm worked intensively with Helios to rebuild their organizational culture from the ground up. We implemented new processes for recognizing and attributing creative contributions. We established mentorship programs that emphasized ethical leadership. We created safe channels for employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. It wasn't perfect. Old habits resisted change. Some longtime executives struggled to adapt to the new expectations. But gradually, incrementally, the culture began to shift. I watched with professional satisfaction as concepts I had advocated for years earlier finally took root. 6 months into the project, I received an email from a junior designer at Helios, someone I had never met, who had joined long after my departure. I just wanted to thank you, she wrote. Because of the attribution system you helped create, my concept for our new product interface was recognized by the executive team. In the old Helios, I'm told, that recognition would have stopped at my manager's desk. Reading her message, I felt a complex emotion that took me a moment to identify. It was closure. Not the bitter satisfaction of revenge or even the vindication of personal success, but something more complete. The knowledge that what I had experienced had led to positive change that extended beyond myself. The final phase of our work with Helios included a rebranding initiative, this time conducted with transparent processes and clear attribution for every element. When the new brand identity was unveiled at an all-company meeting, Teresa Huang made a point of naming each contributor, from senior directors to interns, and describing their specific contributions. As I watched, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. It had begun with theft, the taking of something I had created. That theft had forced me to fight not just for recognition, but for my own sense of worth. The fight had led to unexpected opportunities, to the discovery of strengths I hadn't known I possessed, to the creation of something new and valuable. And now, in a twist I could never have anticipated, it had brought me back to where it all began. Not as a victim seeking justice, but as a leader facilitating transformation. After the presentation, as people mingled and celebrated the new direction, Teresa approached me with a small, elegantly wrapped package. A token of our appreciation, she said, handing it to me. Inside was a crystal paperweight engraved with a simple message. To Julia Mercer, who taught us the value of authentic recognition. I ran my fingers over the engraved words, feeling the weight of them, both literally and figuratively. "Thank you," I said, genuinely moved by the gesture. Teresa smiled. "No, thank you for giving us a second chance when you had every reason not to." Later that evening, as I placed the paperweight on my desk at home, I reflected on the strange, circular journey of the past few years. What had begun as a quest for justice, for revenge, if I was being completely honest with myself, had evolved into something far more meaningful. I had not only reclaimed what was stolen from me, but had helped transform the very environment that had made such theft possible. The true victory, I realized, wasn't in the trademark I had secured, or the compensation I had received, or even the business I had built. It was in the change I had helped create, a change that would benefit others long after my specific grievance had faded from memory. There is a certain poetic justice in that, I thought, to take an act of theft and transform it, through persistence and principle, into a gift that keeps giving to others. The crystal caught the last light of day, sending prisms dancing across my desk. Authentic recognition. Sometimes the things we value most come to us in ways we never could have imagined. Sometimes our greatest strengths emerge from our deepest wounds. And sometimes, just sometimes, what begins as revenge can transform into redemption. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone touched by our journey.